Hey, everybody. Welcome back to your Dawn of Autonomy podcast. I'm Zan Zoldai, your host and the CEO of P3 Tech Consulting. We are in a month that we've dedicated to this theme of complex ops. And when you think about the most complex operations, Black Swift Technologies, this company out of Boulder, Colorado, and Dr. Jack Elston, the CEO and founder, must come to mind because they've been doing these crazy operations through hurricanes and over volcanoes and chasing tornadoes, and the list goes on and on. But Jack, it's so great to have you back to the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Really appreciate it.
Absolutely. So, as I kind of alluded to already, those that have not been following me for a long time, Jack has been on the show. I think this is maybe your fourth time you've been on since season one. By the way, fun fact, everybody, next year will be our 5th-year anniversary of podcasting, in the drone world. Super excited about 2025. But here we are again with Jack because, Jack, your company keeps evolving, and I'm super excited to talk about your latest updates. But before we get to that, let's do this. For those that don't know you, can you give a little bit of background about yourself?
Sure, yeah. Started working with UAS quite a long time ago. We founded BST in 2011 and started out just making autopilot systems, actually built them from scratch in my living room. Got kicked out by my wife eventually because she got tired of it while she was trying to cook dinner and stuff. But eventually started making full platforms. We usually work with fixed wing, but we do both fixed wing and multi-rotor. And as you kind of mentioned, we like chasing the difficult problems. And usually those have to do with dealing with severe weather.
And you started this journey at Boulder, right? When you were in your doctorate program. And if my memory serves here, you met Maciek Stachura. He's your co-founder there. And, so we've had Maciek on Clubhouse before. And so we're great talking to you guys. So you said you kind of started chasing weather initially. What is kind of that origin story of BST? Did it begin in your postdoc, your graduate work? Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, we have a professor at CU, Brian Argro, who brought the Tornado project along with him from OU. So the idea was to use drones to get in a part of the storm that they haven't been able to observe before. Usually they use radar and things like that to observe tornadoes, but you need something to bounce off of for the radar to give them information about it. So you have to have water droplets or dust or even insects work. But there's a part of the storm that's clear air, and they never really been able to get measurements from it, but they know it's one of the critical components for tornado genesis. And so the idea was to fly a drone into that section of the storm. As you can imagine, it's quite a difficult region to get into. So we spent quite a few years getting ready for that. And then we were part of a project called Vortex 2, where it was, I think it's like 20 different universities and 100 different vehicles out chasing these storms. And we were the first ever UAS component to be able to fly into the storm and gather data for them. So it was pretty exciting.
That's amazing. And this is a picture of your team here. And Maciek, I don't know, my right and left are going to be backwards because the way I'm talking to you and what's appearing on the screen, but he's kind of the center guy, right?
Yeah, he's the one holding on to the aircraft there.
There you go. Awesome.
Yeah, him and I both worked on it together. His research was doing really complex networks with aircraft, and so that worked in nicely to what I was doing with atmospheric science because we had to distribute that data to all the different vehicles on the ground.
Okay, very good, very good. And I imagine you mentioned how difficult it was to kind of get into that part of the storm. We're talking like ridiculously high speeds for winds and things of this nature, right? What were some of the challenges initially as you guys were sitting in your kitchen creating components and then ultimately hardware and software to go with it? What were some of the challenges that you had to overcome in your
Mhm.
design?
Yeah, when we were doing that tornado chasing, you imagine it got into pretty significant winds. In fact, at one point in time, we were doing probably around 150 miles an hour of ground speed with the aircraft.
Oh my gosh.
But we did 72 different missions and never lost an aircraft, so we were pretty proud of that. But while we were flying, we were using old military hardware as far as the avionics inside. That was really kind of the only option at the time. And so basically, they when it would get in bad situations, when it was going very fast or turning very quickly, it would kind of get confused, and we'd have to figure out ways to get out of that. So Maciek and I said, "Hey, we can do a better job than this, and not only that, we can make something that's not ITAR controlled, that works better for the commercial environment, a lot simpler to understand and to install." And so that's how we kind of got started making autopilots.
Okay, so it started with the autopilot, and then shortly thereafter, that drone that we saw in the pictures that's your S2, right?
That's correct. Yep.
And then that,
And so,
your fixed wing, and then in relatively short order, you started landing significant contracts with NOAA and NASA. So tell us a little bit about some of that initial work and some of the challenges you were trying to solve for those two organizations.
sure, yeah. So with NOAA, that's actually we're working on putting together a whole order for them right now. We have 20 different tube deployed aircraft that we're going to take into hurricane season this year. Basically, there's a hole in the bottom of the P3 with a little lid on it. They depressurize the cabin, go in at about 8,000 feet, and then drop us out into the eye of the hurricane. Our vehicles, they only weigh about 3 pounds. They're in a protective tube that they deploy out of, and then they go fly around in the storm. And the last time we were able to fly for over 100 minutes with them, and then also communicate out to about 130 nautical miles. So they're pretty capable little aircraft. They'll survive the worst part of the storm, and they even are smart enough to go seek out the part of the storm they're supposed to be sampling. So they have an algorithm on board that says, "Okay, here's where I got dropped. This is approximately where I think the eye wall is." It'll go find the maximum winds and go sit in them and provide that data back.
Oh my God, that's incredible. And so you've been with NOAA and doing this hurricane work for years.
Yeah.
And I know we've talked about this before, but you just kind of alluded to it. So I want to jump to the update. I think I read in the paper the upcoming hurricane season is supposed to be potentially unprecedented, bad, like very bad. And so you're already on tap to do more work. How has those complex operations evolved over time to the point of what you're going to do this year? Like what's new and different in these operations versus maybe ones you did, let's say, 10 years ago?
hmm Yeah, it's been quite a process basically to be able to reliably deploy this very lightweight, small aircraft out of aircraft, a manned aircraft that's moving much faster. So a lot of it was just developing the reliability as far as getting it out of the aircraft and up and flying. We would put quite a bit of work into the communications. Basically, we don't want the P3 to have to do anything to kind of babysit the UAS, and so we want it to go about doing its own mission. So while the UAS is flying around in the bottom part of the storm, and it's usually basically skimming the waves, they want it down in the lowest part of the storm. The P3 is still flying around about 8 to 10,000 feet, doing sampling of the storm itself. So it's dropping other expendables. So they have these tubes with parachutes on them, basically, that drop through the storm that gives them data on the way down. And then the P3 itself makes wind measurements. So it's flying patterns around the eye of the hurricane. To be able to facilitate that, sometimes the P3 gets a ways away, and so that's why we had to get out to this 130 nautical miles to be able to communicate back to the aircraft. It's kind of cool. The data from the drone actually goes up to the P3. It is kind of changed to a different format, but then goes off via satellite to the National Weather Service servers, and then get immediately ingested into the hurricane model. So it's pretty cool, the whole process that goes into that.
That is amazing. I didn't know that aspect of kind of the satcoms piece of it as well. So, I mean, what you've put together is so hyper complex. What sensors are you using for this? Because to obtain this data.
Mhm. Yeah, they're looking to get the measurement of kind of that sea air boundary interface. So most of the energy from the storm comes off of the ocean. So we have a thermal sensor on there that's looking down and gives us the sea surface temperature. We also have a laser altimeter that'll give us wave height. And then we have our own instrument we built to be able to get three-dimensional wind measurements out of it, and along with the usual thermodynamics, so pressure, temperature, humidity type things.
Wow, I'm just listening to you and I'm thinking you need to be talking to Don Bershoff if you're not already from True Weather, because all the different sensors. So this is I'll use the term multi-sensor fusion that you've created here for NOAA, and wow, that's amazing. And I imagine the vehicle itself has to be hyper resilient, as you said. It's already lightweight, but with, I imagine, over the ocean, there's going to be salt and weird challenges to the frame, in addition to just the rain and other weather that's coming at the vehicle the entire time. How
Hmm.
did you harden the vehicle, for lack of a better term, to
Hmm.
perform this kind of mission?
I think a lot of it came down to we were trying to keep it simple for a couple of reasons. One, it's easier to be robust. The other one was we wanted to keep the price low. The National Weather Service doesn't exactly have the deepest of pockets, and we want to make it so that they can use these on all sorts of different storms too. We don't want to just be like one of those things where, all right, we only have 4 of these for this season. We'll just throw them out when we're opportunistic. We want them to be able to use it on a regular basis. So again, keeping it simple, I think, helped with that. A lot of our experience in the past with flying through the corrosive plumes of volcanoes kind of helped us with the sea salt and other particulates that we have to deal with. And then we did have to come up with a pretty unique solution to waterproof it, but still allow us to make those wind measurements. Because the wind measurements are actually made with what we call multi-hole probes. So they're looking at the pressures on the nose cone of the vehicle at different angles, and then using that to kind of back out what the winds do. So we had to get pretty creative there. It's a very small aircraft, and we can't afford a bunch of power to boil off water or anything like that, like they do on standard crewed aircraft, where they'll just heat up the pitot really hot. And so we had to deal with the fact that water droplets, when they hit the front of the aircraft, are generally kind of migrate to where those holes are, where we're making those measurements and just sit there.
Oh yeah.
So we had to figure out ways to make sure that didn't happen.
And you obviously did and don't want to talk about it because it's your secret sauce, but that is like that is unbelievable. So let's talk about NASA, because again, one of your earliest clients. When you think of cutting edge technologies and really interesting complex operations, NASA's always out there doing these wild things, not only on the surface but in the stratosphere and beyond, with other planets. So just tell us a little bit about like kind of your evolution with NASA, and if you have any updates on where you are with NASA today, we'd love to hear those as well, Jack.
Sure thing. Yeah. All sorts of different Earth science. So a lot of people don't realize that NASA not only does space, but they also look at what goes on with the Earth as well. Started out by the S2 as a product of working with NASA. We had to build an aircraft around our soil moisture sensor, basically. It's really sensitive, so we couldn't have electronic components making a bunch of noise, and it needed a particular size of a payload bay, so on and so forth. So we actually designed an aircraft around that payload. It turned out that size of aircraft was really useful for a number of other things. It packs down small enough to go on a commercial airliner, so we can take it to things we need to be really responsive to, like volcano observations. And so we ended up working with NASA, another group in their Earth Science Division, actually at Jet Propulsion Lab in Pasadena, where they were doing volcano observations. Through that, ended up working also with the USGS, and in fact, we continue to go out with the USGS every year to go do observations of remote volcanoes, like ones that can't get out with typical ways of observations, for instance, helicopters, because either the weather's too bad or it's just really expensive to get those assets out to where we go do these things. More recently with NASA, we've been involved with wildfire. So that's been kind of a big concern, especially for the Western states. And we've been working on a project where we were able to show one of our vehicles. We were able to take it out to parts of the storm that were identified through weather models as lacking information, go fly those up to 8 hours before they want a weather prediction, and be able to really improve the wind estimation. So that, as you imagine, with these wildfires, as they're moving through, they're really trying to figure out like where are these going to go. It helps with understanding where they got to evacuate, how they can set up these preventative measures and things like that. So if we can vastly improve that weather measurement, then we can help them out fighting the fire.
So when we talked about NOAA and now we're talking about NASA, and you use this word prediction. I think with NOAA, you talked about how it can kind of seek out the specific location in the hurricane, in that storm, where to take the measurement. That brings to mind artificial intelligence. I don't know if that's what you're using, Jack, but if so, can you just talk a little bit about that? Because data is one thing. Providing it in first of all, using some kind of AI or some kind of system to seek things out, to make predictions, to provide analytics on the back end of that data in near real time, kind of at the edge. It sounds like that's what you're doing. And that's super significant. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure, yeah. So I'm not usually doing the data processing, but certainly AI has become quite the useful tool in meteorology. The traditional methods up until this point have been trying to, do detailed models of things down to even like the molecular level and try and propagate that out. And you can imagine that takes a ton of computing power, and it's really tough to do in real time. So people have had some, you know, I'd say breakthroughs applying AI to the problem, basically looking at historical weather patterns and feeding that into the forecast model instead. And they've seen a significant improvement in accuracy of weather models. So as far as what they're doing with the wildfire stuff here, yeah, that's some of the things they do. I can't take credit for the wildfire prediction that they've been doing. We worked with NCAR, the National Center for Atmospheric Research. They're just right across the street from us. Basically, it's convenient being here in Boulder because there's plenty of those atmospheric science places just all around us. The smart guys there took a very detailed model of the terrain, put that in with their high resolution weather model, and they were able to kind of tell us beforehand, hey, if you just go fly your aircraft over here, we'll have a way better prediction up in the future. It was really cool to kind of see that all work.
That is cool. So, Jack, for all of these flights, is there a pilot that's actually piloting these things, or are these vehicles semi-autonomous, or some of them outright autonomous, depending on the complexity of the operation?
Yeah, the goal for most of these is trying to make them automatic because you imagine most of the scenarios that we're having these in. So, for instance, the hurricane one, we want to kind of the old DoD term of fire and forget, but basically we want them to be able to pre-program it and say like, hey, I want you to go collect information from where the maximum winds are, or I want you to figure out where the center of the hurricane and how fast it's moving, and just give it that high level mission and then drop it out of the aircraft and not worry about the fact that it's going to go do its thing without having to sit there and babysit and make sure you're inputting turn here, go there, those types of things. Eventually, we'd love to get to the point too where we can do multiple of these at once. So have aircraft flying around different parts of the storm, because you imagine these things are huge, and be able to simultaneously sample all sorts of different parts. And you can't really be overtasking the person in charge of them to look at each and every aircraft and figure out what it's doing. So yeah, we spend a lot of time trying to make things as automatic as possible. Same thing with the wildfire regime, right? Once the incident commander kind of puts this thing up, to go make observations, he's got other jobs he needs to be going and doing, and so we can't have him just specifically looking at the drone and figuring out what it's up to.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, all of these sensors we talked about, pretty agnostic in terms of which ones you can integrate. You can custom build things. And at some point along the way, you partnered with a methane detection sensor company.
Mm-hmm.
Tell me about that, because that really, for the first time, what about, I think, a year ago, 2 years ago? Yeah, it was 2 years ago when I was at the Energy Drone and Robotics Coalition Summit. They have a little methane, let's call it co-located event. And I sat through some of those. It was very eye-opening to me.
Mm-hmm.
And the increased use of drones in detecting methane. Obviously, there's satellite imagery, but that can only give you so much detail. And the drones are much closer in, on the ground to help find very specific issues, like, for example, breaking a pipe, things like this. Um, how did you get involved in the methane detection arena with your technology?
It's kind of the mixture of several different things. One, we're spending quite a bit of time figuring out how to accurately measure winds from small aircraft, and it's definitely one of the things that goes into measuring any sort of emission, particularly methane, where you're looking at, if you're trying to get small leaks, you're looking at very small changes. And so trying to fly around, figuring out, measure a parcel of air and figure out, all right, where did this methane come from? And then, how fast was it coming out of that location? It's pretty tricky. It's quite a hard problem to solve. In fact, I wouldn't say we've fully solved it yet, but we're working at it. We've also taken a lot of stuff we've learned from doing volcano observations, where we're also looking for trace gases. Now, usually it's in much, much higher concentrations, but a lot of the similar stuff comes into play as far as characterizing the plume, trying to figure out how much mass is coming out of that volcano. So we partnered with a local company here named Quanta 3. They do a really good job for terrestrial-based sensors. And so we had them work with us and try and figure out something we could do in an airborne way. The idea is, these oil and gas sites, especially what they call upstream, or where they're actually getting the oil out of the ground, there's thousands of them all over the place. And so it's kind of cost prohibitive to put nice sensors in the ground everywhere to see if any of your equipment's leaking methane. And so
Right.
you kind of need a different option there. And you could do satellite, but satellite's really kind of coarse as far as the resolution. So you could see big leaks, and you could see height and elevation of methane in a certain area, but you can't really see the leaks down to the smaller ones that most oil and gas companies are trying to catch, or the new regulations are requiring. There's also options to do that with piloted aircraft, but that becomes somewhat expensive. And then also you're running into some issues there with those sensors as far as how good of resolution they can get. And you're bouncing that. Usually it's a laser you're bouncing off the ground. And so what's on the ground can actually affect how accurately you're able to measure how much methane is coming out of a particular area. So our thought was, with our fixed wing aircraft, we fly very low to the ground. We split the difference. We get very close, so we can do highly accurate measurements, but we can fly for probably up to 2 to 3 hours with this particular aircraft and payload. So we can cover quite a bit of ground in that amount of time and reduce the cost it requires to go and measure each one of these sites.
Wow, there's so much crossover with all of these different operations. And I imagine also from a design standpoint, engineering, you have to be concerned about any kind of downwash or, kind of impacts of the vehicle's actual operation with the measurements and the sensors that it's using. So I imagine that that's a very difficult challenge to overcome. And that's because you guys not only have the S2, we saw in the video, you have a rotorcraft too, right?
That's correct. Yeah, the nice thing about rotorcraft is you get in very close and you can sit in an area for a while. When you're doing atmospheric measurements, it's disturbing everything around you, like you said. So to be able to get accurate wind measurements, to get accurate concentration measurements, it's actually really difficult. We spent some time down in Costa Rica trying to monitor how much CO2 is coming out of the sides of volcanoes, so just very small vents further down, not up at the top of the volcano. And we found that when we'd hover down in the vents, if the vents were small enough, the vehicle would actually pull in the air from above it and just make it so we didn't really see any CO2 being emitted from that vent, even if the concentrations were particularly high by that vent. So multi-rotors make it really tricky to measure the atmosphere for sure.
Yeah, yeah. So you, like I said, you can kind of custom build and then design to what the needs are. And you mentioned in passing DoD, but this is the Department of Defense, another group that you've really started working with recently. So, and part of it, I remember there's a SIBR, a Small Business Innovation Research grant that you guys received in terms of my former service, the United States Air Force, and runway operations with soil moisture. So let's talk about the soil moisture in general, how you even got into that business, and then how that crossed over into these complex operations for the DoD.
Fair. Yeah, that started a while ago too. In terms, we keep finding these applications that take us an awful lot of work to develop, but it's a high level or a big barrier of entry for any other competitors in the space, I guess. But this one started back in 2012. It was a NASA project. They launched a satellite called SMAP, and that also provides soil moisture maps. It's really cool. It covers the entire globe very quickly, but the resolution's not high. So what they wanted is, when they're flying over pixels from the satellite, basically they're covered with lakes or other things where it doesn't cover the entire thing. They need some way to kind of validate the measurements they're getting and see where it makes sense. So the idea was to have us fly below where the satellite was and make very high resolution measurements, and so they could compare the two of them. We ended up doing that for about a year, but then we found that there's plenty of other soil integrity, which is quite closely related to how much water's in it. Meaning, is it mud? Can you drive over it? And so that's very important for things like construction equipment. We actually found it's very useful for knowing for railways, particularly over in England where you get these wet, rainy seasons. You can have derailments if they get too much water in the ground. And then the more recent one we've been working on is these forward air bases where, they'll have something that is either grass, dirt, or very quickly made in the last couple weeks. And they need to know if they can land an aircraft there and still get it, still take off and it won't get stuck there. So right now they have just a person going out with a cone and a weight. Basically, they drop a weight on top of the cone and see how far it goes into the ground. And you do that a few points and then try and guess that that's going to be true for the entire runway. The cool thing about what we do is we can go scan the entire runway very quickly and then give them an answer about whether or not it's safe to land.
That's unbelievable. And you landed that, was it last year, towards the end of last year, that SBIR? Really interesting because there's always, forward operations, but even just steady state, having worked on a number of Air Force bases, you mentioned construction, the civil engineering folks, there's always construction. There's always, we're going to build it, even if it's not a runway, it's a road, it's a building. And so these applications are really, really endless, super cool. We have an interesting picture. I want to kind of dive deeper into some of your aircraft. I want to pop up this next picture. Now, this is your SO? Am I saying this right? S0, SO?
Yeah. Apologies for the naming convention. S0. We had the S1 and the S2, and this one was smaller, so we called it the S0.
Okay. Well, if you make an even smaller one, maybe it'll be like the -5 or something.
Sure.
But this is cool. So this is the one that you're dropping out of the P3s for NOAA?
That's correct. Yeah.
Okay. And what we're looking at here, is this your workshop in Boulder?
Yeah, part of it at least. That's one of the ones that we're assembling right now for sending out into the storms this year.
Oh my God. So just for perspective, how tiny is this thing?
Yeah, distance wise. Well, that wings expanse there is probably about 2.5, 3 feet. So
okay, all right. But it pops out of a tube and then it expands?
Yeah, so the wing swivels. That black wing you kind of see on top there, it swivels and goes on top of the vehicle. Again, just kept it pretty simple. Didn't do anything like a switchblade or something like that. And then it slides down into a tube. The tube itself is mainly just a bunch of weight. It's designed to keep the tube from hitting the P3 when we drop it out of the hole in the bottom of the floor, basically.
Right.
And then so it has a small parachute just to orient things. Once it gets oriented, it drops off the tube because just the wing will swing out. It's still attached to the parachute at that point in time, so it kind of slows down a little bit, but it's still going pretty fast, probably about 50, 60 miles an hour on the parachute, and then it drops itself off and flies into the storm.
Now, I assume these are expendable, meaning NOAA's not recovering these, or do you actually on the backside of a hurricane actually pick a couple of these up off the ground somewhere or the water?
Yeah, because we can get all that nice high rate data, but unfortunately, we're doing observations that's far enough offshore. There's no way they'd be able to make it back.
Okay, very, very interesting. Hey everybody, if you're listening out there, can you say replicator? I'm just saying. All right, so let's show this other image, and this is kind of a just like a graphic image of this. I think this is so cool. Looks great with the pink, by the way. So now, is this the S0 or is this your S2? Like, what am I looking at here?
Yeah, so this is a VTOL variant of that. So this one no longer we can't launch it out of the tube, but those two front rotors actually tilt up, and so he allows you to set it on the ground. It takes off vertically. And then this one was designed for doing atmospheric profiles. So if you think about replacing the bottom part of what a weather balloon can do, it very quickly goes up to about 15,000 feet and then comes back down and gives you all the information that a weather balloon would do. So without having something that's expendable, without using all what's becoming very expensive as far as the helium to fill those balloons, you can go and get the same weather information.
Well, and not only that, but my understanding is those weather balloons, I think there's specific locations that they're being launched from for the National Weather Service. This is my, I'm channeling Don Bershoff right now. there's specific locations and only so many times a day they do it. It's very, not scripted, but very kind of regularized in how they do it. Whereas this vehicle that you created could really go anywhere.
Mm-hmm. And this is the one that we're using for those wildfire so one of the really cool things about this is with that twin motor setup, we're able to make it dash well over 100 miles an hour. And so
Whoa.
we can put it up in the mountains in some very difficult wind conditions, and it can survive them.
Jack, I mean, you and I've said this to you before. I've been obviously super fans from the first time I met you, and I started picking your brain. I don't know anybody that's doing the kind of things that you're doing. Just really phenomenal. We do have a picture. I'm going to go out on a leap and say this is the S2 because it's from the little launch thing. There we go.
Yeah.
So this thing right now it like flings off. That's like a catapult.
Yeah, that's correct. That is kind of like a tripod that folds out. It hooks to a case that has all the different compressors, tanks, everything it needs to, launch the aircraft. Basically, a piston runs down the middle of the rail and pulls a cart that the aircraft's on, and it'll get it up to 40 miles an hour in the middle, or by the end of that rail, which is only about 8 feet long.
That is amazing. And all three of these are, shall I say, highly portable because you're taking them on airplanes, whether you're going to the Arctic or Iceland or maybe even downrange if the military is taking some of these, down at bare bases, if you will, to help with the building of the runways, the Red Horse teams. So you've been able to kind of perfect the portability and compactness of all of these.
Yeah, I mean, so we do a lot of the operations ourselves, and we learn a lot of lessons that way. I mean, one of the things on the S2 is you can assemble everything without having to use any tools. And we did that on purpose because when you're in Greenland and it's minus 40 outside, you don't really be taking your gloves off to be able to put the aircraft together. Same thing, kind of thing with portability. We've launched and operated them from a number of different, very interesting locations, as you can imagine, especially doing the volcano observations. And so, yeah, you don't want to be having a lot of heavy equipment that you have to try and hand carry into locations.
Well, I never really thought about I didn't know it was almost like a Lego where you just kind of can plug these things all together and keep your gloves on in Greenland. I always thought it was funny that Greenland is freezing and you think Iceland and Iceland is more green, but anyway, it is freezing in Greenland, everybody, if you didn't know that. But to do all of these operations, you have obviously the hardware, and we've been talking quite a bit about that. We saw some of these different configurations and talked about some of the complex operations you're doing, but you mentioned Machek early on, and he's kind of the brains behind some of this software. You guys created the SwiftCore flight management system. So tell us about that.
Sure thing. Yeah, it's been around for a while now. Like I said, since 2011. Back then, there wasn't really all of this Autopilot, Pixhawk, all those things. The open source projects weren't really prevalent then. They were there, but very much in their infancy. So out of necessity, we had to build our own from scratch. So started with just the math and the first principles and put together our own autopilot system and kind of went from there. We designed it around being very intuitive. So we just kept it a tablet-based interface, as few kind of things exposed to the operator as possible. Now, certainly you can go delve down and get into the details and change all sorts of stuff with the aircraft, but we try and keep it very simple. And kind of the cool thing we've managed to do with it is our training sessions only take about 2 days. And so the group that was doing the flights in Greenland, they hadn't even flown like a multi-rotor drone. They had no RC experience, nothing like that. In 2 days, we were able to train them up where they were able to go do flights in minus 20 to minus 40 degrees up to, I think they went to nearly 15,000 feet and very strong
Wow.
winds in Greenland. They did 100 flights and didn't lose an aircraft. So we were pretty happy with how intuitive that was for them to be able to go do their work.
Yeah, that's significant. And, the way you're designing all of these drones to be also modular and kind of open system, plug and play, very significant across the board. We think a lot when we think about MOSA of the Department of Defense, but when you think about the commercial side too, Jack, in addition to everything you've already been doing, I think beyond visual line of sight for, just name the inspection, blank inspection, because all you have to do is put a different sensor on there, to be able to go these really long distances in crazy weather conditions, for whatever, pick a use case. I feel like it's almost limitless. And so along those lines, what other updates do you have? And also, what do you have on tap that you can share with us?
Yeah, so as far as the BB loss work, we've been doing that fairly regular basis for the last couple of years. Most of the time, it's been in really remote locations. We've been doing that for the volcano observations. The last one we did in Alaska, I think we flew 25 miles out and 7,000 feet up to go to make those observations, and so
Wow.
pretty significant distance. The nice thing about operating in Alaska, though, is FAA has identified it as kind of a test area for a lot of these BVLOS operations, so it's a little bit easier to get permission there. But we've been looking at bringing those things in to do them in the continental U.S. as well. As you can imagine, as you said, with the methane detection, being able to take a look at pipelines or just even fly between all the different sites also requires this BVLOS operations. And so we've been working on several different systems to try and make that safe, and keeping our ear to the ground as far as what's going on with the regulations to make sure that we hit those requirements too.
Jack, as I think about all the things you've done and, working with NASA, NOAA, now the DoD, it makes me wonder, have you worked at all, or are you looking to work with, for example, the Department of Homeland Security or FEMA? Because, a lot of these applications would be awesome, I would think, in disaster. Well, first of all, preparation when something's coming your way from a weather standpoint or some kind of an incident. Uh, Disaster response, when it happens and things, power lines or whatever has gone down, how bad is the flooding, how far out, where do we need to find people? And then of course, in that recovery phase afterwards, trying to build that community back up. Are you working with any of these groups, or even public safety? I know the public safety community is always looking for resilient drones that they can employ for all of these purposes.
Yeah, fair. Good point. As you've heard, there's quite a different number of applications we've been working on. Being the size team that we are, it's tough to cover all of them.
Yeah.
Certainly, I agree that FEMA is a very interesting one there, but we haven't done a ton of work with them as of this point, at least.
All right. Well, we need to change that because I think this is a game changer for FEMA. Honestly, when you think about and look, there's companies like Verizon, that are out there during disasters because it's their systems that are down.
Mhm.
When you think about critical infrastructure, they have their own disaster response teams. You've probably seen. I think it was it AT&T, the commercial where they have their drone in the commercial. So even the commercial vendors and critical infrastructure users, I mean, this
Yeah.
is like perfect for them. So you've your latest update, I think, is this SIBR for the soil moisture sensing, and the for the runway applications.
Mhm.
Is that like a 3-year or 2-year R&D effort?
1.5 years, so like 18 months.
Okay, 18 months. Can you share any details about that? Like where they might be testing this out there?
Sure. Yeah. We're testing a lot of it locally. We have plenty of areas here that we can either use water ourselves to kind of irrigate them, or they naturally have near lakes and streams and stuff like that. But the final test will be down at Air Force Base that they test a lot of this soil integrity work. It's down in Florida, basically on the Panhandle.
Oh yeah, I mean, talk about swampland. I mean, they've got sink. We couldn't even get insurance at our house when we lived down there near Tampa because of the sinkhole issue. Not only that, of course, the hurricanes. So almost everything you've been talking about, Jack, is definitely happening in the Panhandle and other places of Florida,
Sure. Yeah.
to be sure. So you've been doing so much, and I'm so excited to talk a little bit with you now, Jack, about some of the recognition your team, you and the team, has received for all this incredible work. So brag on your team a little bit because you've recently had a couple of interesting awards, and so let's talk about those.
Sure, yeah. We were just recognized recently for the Mercury 100. It's the top revenue increasing companies in Colorado, and so that was a fun accolade to get for sure. Um, and then the group that we're doing the science with actually just recently got an award from Congress for their efforts doing the hurricane sampling, just because of the uniqueness of it, and they kind of persevered through all the stuff that happened with COVID. Certainly, that funding for that project could have easily died up if it weren't for a lot of the scientists that we worked with at NOAA. So it's cool to be part of that group as well.
Well, for those that don't know about the science and technology and kind of aeronautical, aerospace ecosystem here in Colorado, it's significant. We've got a huge space contingent here, all kinds of small to very big prime companies in Colorado Springs and Boulder and Denver, across the state. And so I just wanted to kind of highlight that because this Mercury 100 list of the fastest growing private company, one of the fastest growing private companies in Colorado, when you understand the competition, if you will, or the landscape out there in this state, I think it just underscores the importance of that award and basically the importance of what you've been doing with your team for the last several years, Jack. So congratulations on that. That's super exciting and well deserved. And that congressional award, as you mentioned, look, the reality is weather is something that is going to keep getting worse and worse with climate change. And we've seen the world literally be on fire the past several years. We know this hurricane season coming up is going to be brutal. It's affecting everybody, including now, I guess the latest thing is the crazy turbulence people are experiencing on regular commercial flights as a result of some of this, like bad injuries and things of this nature. So to be able to facilitate the research into this, to be able to understand these patterns better, to help predict them, to help save lives, it's just so significant what you're doing. And even the runway work, it sounds like, all right, they're building runways out there in the middle of nowhere for the Air Force, but you can't do operations, logistics right now until the whole VTOL thing really does literally take off. I'm talking the air taxi, like the big ones. We're going to have the big cargo planes, and you can't do those operations, any of the services, because the Air Force, they're a logistics hub, not only equipment but people. And so everything you're doing has such huge impact across the board. So thank you for that. Super excited always to talk to you and to catch up. So looking forward, you've got this hurricane work coming up with NOAA. You're still working on the SIBR with the Air Force and some of this sensing with the soil and the runways. What else do you have on tap for this? First of all, we're like halfway done the year almost, which is insane. What else do you have on tap for 2024? And as you're looking into your crystal ball for 2025, what are you thinking?
So for 2024, we're continuing the wildfire work. Wildfire season will start picking up here in Colorado in the fall.
Sadly, yes.
Kind of coincident with, so that'll be a busy time for us for sure. Soil moisture testing, that's kind of always going on for us, and we're always trying to find new uses for that. We're working with the USGS to find the next target for where we're going to go do volcano observations. A whole bunch of interesting options there, everywhere from Indonesia to Chile to kind of you name it. And so, I got plenty of stuff coming up. As far as with 2025, though, one of the things we're most excited about is we're going to be releasing the vertical takeoff and landing version of the S2 that we're calling the S3, mainly because it's a bigger aircraft. It'll carry the same payload, but now it'll be able to take off and land vertically. So no more having to carry around that launcher at all. It'll just, you set it down and it goes and does its mission.
So how you said it's going to be bigger? How much will this weigh approximately without sensors? And
still it'll be relatively light, so probably around 25 to 30 pounds. So not a heavy aircraft by any means, but it'll still carry like a 5-pound payload with a fairly large amount of volume.
Okay, and of course it's the S3 because it's also the next number on your list. So highly predictable, but that's okay. We love it. The 0 through 3, you've got a whole bunch of aircraft going on there, Jack. So that's awesome. All right, so you're going to be traveling all over the place. I don't know when you're home, but are you also or your team plugging into some of these upcoming events? And if so, where might people be able to see either you or some of your teammates running around the floor or a booth or something?
Sounds good. Yeah. Hopefully, probably the next one will be Commercial UAV Expo. We'll be at a number of different other conferences, but they're very specific for like wildfire and things like that. That'll be the next like drone one that we'll be at.
Okay, well, excellent, everybody. We're super excited about Com UAV. If you haven't put it on your calendar yet, travel on Labor Day, get there for my 4th annual Flash Mob networking happy hour. Location TBD, but it's always a blast, and start networking before the event actually kicks off. It's a good time. So Jack, hopefully you'll be able to attend that, and we'll definitely see you there.
Oh, great.
All right, so we talked about the future. We've got about a minute left, Jack. So I want to cede the floor to you on, any concluding remarks you want to, and also please tell the audience how they can reach you and your team.
Oh, sure. Yeah, I mean, you just go to our website. It's pretty simple, bst.aero, AERO. You can go see a lot of the stuff that we're doing. There's contact info there as well. We have YouTube, Instagram, the usuals, and so you can kind of see some of the videos. We're trying to get better about posting things. Usually we're so busy while we're out doing the operations that we kind of forget to do that, but there is a lot of really cool stuff that we've done, and so we're trying to be better about documenting that so everyone else can see what it is that we do, to help out with all these different applications you talked about. A lot of them hopefully benefiting the public at large. So.
No, that's great, and for sure check out the Don Zoldi YouTube channel too. And Jack has been on the show, as I said, a handful of times before, so you can watch those shows and really follow his journey from the beginning to now. Every year it's something new and different, so that's super cool. And yeah, so thank you so much, Jack, for taking the time for joining us again. We're excited to be with you on this journey, to have seen from the S1 and 2 to the 0, now to the 3 coming up. And we look forward to seeing you in person here shortly. In the meantime, everybody, thanks so much for joining us. We are out here.
Thanks, Tom.